gives me enormous pleasure as Dean of the Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences to welcome you to this evening's inaugural lecture to be given by Professor Martin Holbraad, who 2 or 3 years ago was a very competent and pleasant Vice Dean to have on the faculty team, but he then proved his incredible research success by winning a major research grant, going off and doing incredibly interesting things. So I'm sure we'll hear some of what he's been doing this evening. He'll be introduced, first of all, properly by Professor Alan Abramson from the Anthropology Department, and when he's finished his lecture, the vote of thanks will be given by David Burrows, who is Reader of Fine Art at the Slade School of Fine Art. After that, you're all very warmly invited to a reception, which this evening, unusually for those of you who are aficionados of these inaugural lectures, usually the receptions are downstairs, but not tonight. They are in the Anthropology Department. So those of you who do not know where it is will have to follow people who look as if they know where they're going and have a glint in their eye going to a reception. It's in Taverton Street, so just follow people to the Anthropology Department at the end, but I'll remind you again then. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to Alan Abramson to make the formal introduction.
Thank you, Mary. I want to start with a quote. The argument is complex, at times vertiginously so. Any engagement with recursivity has this cognitive effect, and this book takes recursivity as far as it can go. But it throws wonderfully clear light over one of the more shadowy zones of the anthropological exchange, to wit, the precise nature of the relation between the conceptual presuppositions of the observer and the observed in the ethnographic encounter. So says, if you look on the back of his book, Eduardo Viveros de Castro of this man's monograph, Truth in Motion. Coming from so eminent and so sage a commentator, this is enviable praise, and it reminds us, should we need reminding, that in Martin we have a colleague, that's we in the Anthropology Department here, who is a dutiful academic, but equally an intellectual beast. Indeed, I've already warned him that it's not going to be as sober as he wanted. Yeah. Indeed, well aware of the ambitious theoretical history of anthropology, Martin is not one to fatalistically surrender to the agnosticism that these days clings to epistemological and, dare I say it, ontological matters. Do we need to worry about the status of anthropological knowledge? Do we really need to lose sleep over whether ethnographies might be true or not? And if not, in what ways not? Of course we do, he would answer. In fact, come to any seminar and watch Martin himself in motion, tirelessly engaging with the dodgy frameworks to which many of us are theoretically married. If he is a prodigious writer, and we'll come to that in a moment, Martin is also a great creature of seminar ecology, always generously responsive, and I mean it, to the words of the speaker animal, always alive to the inner DNA of an argument and to its capacity to yield more for its author. Not long after he was hired, Martin came up to me to say that he'd heard that I convened a reading group in the department which had cosmological interest, which was true. True, I said. Could he join? Yes, of course. What's it called, he wanted to know. The Death Group, I said, to which he said, great, but the Death Group's name has to go. We have to change the name. Thus was CROC conceived. Cosmology, religion, ontology, and culture. A really cuddly acronym. Till the Americans who attended, of course, remarked that from the existential point of view, CROC itself wasn't that great either. That aside, over the years, Martin has pushed CROC in brave directions, one of which, I have to say, was a Saturday morning cornflake and Weetabix workshop on Levi-Strauss's iconic equation for the structure of myth. But the most telling of these But the most telling of these developments of Kroc, I think, was towards an interfaculty collaboration on cosmology, which drew in UCL colleagues from astro and quantum physics, from STS and the Slade, as well as from anthropology. There are always, of course, great difficulties in establishing such interdisciplinary collaborations, and that Martin succeeded, with Othar Lahav of astrophysics especially, in getting this one off the grounds, speaks to his enviable drive, his dark energy, we could say, as much as his insight. And I think to his unending enthusiasm for producing anthropological knowledge in unexpected ways and unexpected places, not just in the usual haunts. And this includes in the theatre, or at least at the interface of ethnography, theoretical and theatrical practice. You often hear it said that so-and-so has got on research-wise because she or he has taught less, has supervised neglectfully, and has cleverly avoided awful administration, relative of horrible histories. I almost hate to say it, but Martin is precisely the opposite, the epitome of the academic, who has involved himself profoundly in each of these spheres. In particular, I want to stress how well he's admired by the students who have taken his classes, to the extent there are probably as many budding ontologists peopling the intellectual jet stream of our common rooms as rodents there are running on the ground. And that means lots. That means lots. At every point in his career in the department, Martin has administered, managed us, and enabled. And though he won't thank me for saying it, he's actually been, and actually is, a pretty good bureaucrat. You might think, therefore, that Martin is horribly perfect, unflawed, and infallible. But of course he isn't that. Just looking at the very frumpy Scandinavian bike that he regularly parks in the quad in anthropology indicates that this cannot possibly be the case. Get a proper one. Yeah. Martin was born in Canberra, Australia, which was a surprise to me. He's Australian. He has a first-class degree in philosophy and a master's in anthropology from the LSE. His PhD was from Cambridge, based, as most of us know, on his ethnographic work with Cuban diviners in Havana. He's been a research fellow at Pembroke College, Cambridge, as well as visiting scholar in the Institute of Philosophy in Havana, and also in the Department of Politics at the University of Copenhagen. He is currently the primary researcher and grant winner for CARP, Making Selves, Making Revolutions, Comparative Anthropologies of Revolutions. He is currently editor of the journal Social Analysis, as well as sitting on the board of several other journals, including the JRI, Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. He is the author, co-author, and soon-to-be author of 8 books and special editions, though I probably counted wrong, as well as having penned numerous articles and papers, to which he is now going to add tonight's inaugural lecture, which is entitled Shapes of Relations, Steps to a New Social Morphology. Not bad, if you ask me. I therefore hand you over, finally, to Professor Martin Holbraad.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'm so glad I asked you to do this. And thank you all so much for coming. Let me see if I can get this amazing thing that I've been working on for at least a month up and going. Let me just see. Good. When I was an undergraduate in the early 1990s, studying at the LSE what I had hoped would be straight philosophy, but turned out to be mainly the philosophy of science, we were taught that there are 2 basic approaches in the social sciences. One models itself on the natural sciences and sets out to explain social phenomena in terms of their causes and effects. The other models itself on the humanities and prefers to treat social phenomena in terms of their meaning. So, causal explanation on the one hand, meaningful interpretation on the other. Now, I can't speak for the social sciences as a whole, but as far as social anthropology goes, I'm convinced that this dilemma is false. Indeed, I choose to open my inaugural lecture with this point because, looking at it in retrospect, my conversion to anthropology as a graduate student and ever since has been largely about showing why this is the case. and articulating a third option for anthropology, neither explanation nor interpretation, as it were, or at least not primarily. Throughout my time at UCL, my efforts in this regard have been channeled rather single-mindedly into the by now somewhat notorious debate about the role of ontological arguments in anthropology. Looking at it now, it may be fair to say that the debate about ontology has generated more heat than light, although for me the basic thought is really quite simple. The problem with explanation and interpretation, goes the argument, is that they both presuppose that the anthropologist is in principle equipped even to describe the social phenomena in which she or he is concerned, is interested. By which I mean simply that the anthropologist is able to express, in a way that makes sense, what the phenomena in question actually are. In the case of explanation, this is quite obvious. If you think that as an anthropologist, your prime task, when faced with a given social phenomenon, Maori gift exchange, say, or Cuban spirit possession, or Brexit, that your task is to explain it with reference to its causes and consequences, you must be assuming from the start that you can describe what the phenomenon in question actually is in the first place. To ask why something is as it is, you must first know what it is. In the case of interpretation, on the other hand, the same assumption features not as the premise of anthropological analysis, but rather as its presumed outcome. When faced with gifts, spirit, or Brexit, says the interpretive anthropologist, our task must be to understand what these phenomena mean for the people who engage in them. In other words, we must perform a cultural translation. Take the phenomenon that initially seems opaque, and, by placing it sensitively in its local context, translate it into terms that you and your anthropological readers can understand. But again, this presupposes in principle that the anthropologist must have at his or her disposal the vocabulary, in fact the concepts, that are able to express the otherwise local meaning of the phenomenon in question. Initially, we may not know how best to describe the phenomena that therefore pique our anthropological interest, but given sufficient local knowledge and interpretive panache, we should be able to do so. But what if that's not the case? What if what makes things like gifts, spirit, and Brexit so interesting to us as anthropologists is the fact that we are not actually able to describe them? Because in one way or other, they go beyond the concepts that we have at our disposal. Take the gift, for example. According to one of the most famous arguments our discipline has produced, thanks to Marcel Mauss, Maori and other people Mauss imagined at the time that he was writing as archaic feel obliged to reciprocate the ceremonial gifts that are at the center of their social life because they believe that these gifts contain something of the spirit of the donor. For the Maori, when I give you a gift, I'm giving you a part of myself, the spiritual essence the Maori call hau. And therefore, you are obliged, morally, physically, and spiritually, as Mauss put it, to give me something in return. Now, beguiling as it has been to generations of anthropologists, Mauss's description of the Maori gift as a thing that is itself a person, and I quote from Mauss, elsewhere he describes it as a thing that is not inert, is profoundly ambiguous. The thing about things, if we know what we mean by the term at all, is that they are not precisely people, and that they are indeed inert. So when Mauss says that Maori gifts are things that are people and not inert, he is not, as it may seem, telling us something fascinating about what the Maori take gifts to be like. He is merely proving the limits of our ability as anthropologists to express what these Maori gifts are from within a conceptual repertoire consisting of ideas such as things, people, the physical, the spiritual, the moral, and so on. If the best we can say about Maori gifts is that they contain the spirit of the donor, then we might as well admit that we are unable sensibly to describe what these things are at all. We simply don't have the concepts, since the ones that we do have land us in all sorts of ambiguities, inconsistencies, and contradictions. My attempt to articulate an alternative to the false dilemma between explanation and interpretation, then, takes off from just this realization. If the basic problem that such quintessentially anthropological objects of inquiry as Maori gifts pose is that we lack the concepts with which to understand what they are, then surely what we need to be doing is generating for ourselves concepts that are able to describe them. Never mind explanation and interpretation, then. The most basic task for anthropology must be conceptualization. Is there a way to conceive of gifts, for example, that would allow me to make sense of the Maori notion that they contain what they call the how? Where would such a concept leave the distinction between things and people, the physical and the spiritual, that seems to stand in the way in Morse's famous account? Is there perhaps a different way of defining what a person is and what a thing that renders the two logically compatible, and so on? These are all ontological questions pertaining to what such things as things, people, spirits, and the relationships between them might be, and hence the designation of this whole approach as an ontological term. Indeed, the philosophical overtones of that heavy word, which I think have caused a lot of suspicion and misunderstanding, are nevertheless not accidental. To the extent that what is at stake here are questions about basic categories of understanding, anthropology on this account must involve an activity that many would associate with philosophy, namely the generation, articulation, and critical analysis of concepts. You can imagine that for someone who went to university to find Plato, Leibniz, and Arendt, but was instead bombarded with Popper and Lakatos, this prospect for anthropology might be quite a consolation. Now, as I say, up to now, my time at UCL has been spent mainly on helping to elaborate this approach, testing it on my own ethnographic work in Cuba, exploring its implications comparatively, and, it must be said, defending it from its many critics. Much of this work has developed in interaction with our undergraduate as well as graduate students, perhaps the biggest blessing of working here at UCL, as well, of course, as long-term conversations with a number of scholars working in this field, particularly, as Alan mentioned, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in Brazil, who put the whole approach on the table in the first place, and Morten Petersen, my best anthropological buddy, with whom we've just published a book that tries to set all this out as clearly as possible. The book's title is pretty explicit. It's called The Ontological Turn, an Anthropological Exposition. So it's just like out there. You know. For the rest of this evening, however, I want to do something slightly different. Namely, to disembed somewhat the concern with conceptualization from the argument about ontology, in order to show that the activity of turning ethnographic materials, just life really, into concepts is far more basic to what we do as anthropologists than the somewhat rarefied-looking concern with the limits of intelligibility that the ontological argument I just outlined brings to the fore. In effect, I want to reverse the logical priority of the argument I just made. Conceptualization is what anthropology most basically involves anyway, I suggest, and the need for the kind of conceptual invention that arises in situations where we reach the limits of our own capacity to describe our material is really a consequence of this core anthropological delight in turning life into ideas. In fact, one might best see this delight in concepts and their relationships as an anthropological sensibility, a kind of intellectual aesthetic that permeates our discipline, even though we don't necessarily always recognize it for what it is. This sensibility, I will suggest, is morphological through and through, inasmuch as it involves giving ethnographic phenomena particular conceptual shapes. Indeed, at the very end of the lecture, I'll go as far as suggesting that for this reason, there may be perhaps some mileage in comparing anthropology not to science, nor to the humanities, and nor even to philosophy, as I just did, but instead to art practice. Anthropology, if you like, as painting by concept. To get a sense of this irreducible morphological component of anthropological thinking operating in action, it pays to return to the example I've already given, namely Morse on the spirit of the gift. In using this earlier to illustrate the motivation of the ontological argument in anthropology, I drew attention to the basic ambiguity of Morse's idea that the Maori gift is a thing that is itself a person, as he puts it. But of course, this misgiving can only arise in the first place because this gloss, the very notion of a thing that is itself a person, is itself an act of conceptualization, albeit a deficient one, as I've suggested. In particular, what makes this a conceptualization in the sense that interests me here is the fact that more than just a translation or interpretive gloss on the Maori ethnography he was working with, Morse's statement about things and people here serves to transpose that ethnography into the analytical language in which his prime anthropological problem with reciprocity is cast. Morse's point about the connection between people and things in Maori gift exchange, in other words, does not merely translate Maori concepts and actions laterally into European ones, but rather transposes them vertically into the anthropological terms in which a particular analytical problem is framed. Consider the sequencing of the argument. First, we have a statement of the problem. Why do people in archaic societies, as Morse calls them, feel obliged to reciprocate the gifts they receive, the objects they are given, as he puts it? So, people and things. That's how the problem is framed. Then we have the Maori ethnography, which famously takes the form of an indigenous exegesis in which the Maori elder Tamati Ranaipiri explains to the New Zealand ethnographer Elsden Best the meaning of the Maori notion of how. If you give me a taonga, a valuable article in Morse's translation, and I give it on to someone else, and that person gives me a taonga of his own in return, then I must give that taonga back to you, since it has the how associated with your original gift to me, which, as Morse interprets it, is your own spiritual essence, as he calls it. So an indigenous exegesis of how and taonga is first laterally translated and glossed interpretively, and then transposed vertically into the framework that Morse's initial problem about the relationships between persons and things has set up. The Maori ethnography, in other words, is pressed into the service of Morse's argument about reciprocity by being moulded conceptually into the shape he gives to his problem, namely as a question about the relationship between persons and the things that pass between them. But my point here is that it is precisely at this moment of conceptualization that the work of the argument really becomes apparent. And it becomes quite literally apparent because its nature is morphological, a matter of refiguring the relationships that the problem of reciprocity implies by giving them a particular shape. While we, as readers, can be expected to assume that spirits are attributes of people rather than things, Morse's Maori materials force us to imagine a situation in which things abound spiritually with the people that give them. But note how this bond is given a particular shape in Morse's conceptualization, namely as a form of containment. The gift has within it the spirit of the donor. This conceptual shapeshift, then, allows Morse completely to transform the way we imagine gift exchange, a big aha moment every undergraduate in anthropology must go through, again by changing its basic shape. If gifts contain within them the spirit of the donor, then gift exchange cannot be conceived as just the circulation of things between people, but must rather be understood as the interpenetration of people by each other, or perhaps I should say gift people by each other. If the gift contains within it a part of the donor, an aspect of his spirit, then the person who receives it effectively receives a part of another person. So in that sense, the gift itself is a shapeshifter. As it moves from hand to hand, it changes the shape of the people its motion co-opts, involving them in an ever-unfolding dynamic of mutual expansion and contraction. Now, it's worth noting here how weak this argument becomes if it is understood as an attempt to explain the social facts of reciprocity, which is, of course, how Morse himself presented it. The problem is that the conceptual shift of thinking of gifts as part persons, and therefore of gift exchange as a matter of mutual interpenetration, is not in itself causal in nature. It gives us a compelling new way to think of gifts, not the reason why people are compelled to reciprocate them. Indeed, in teaching the argument over the years, I found myself sounding rather unconvincing when trying to answer students' inevitably straight question. Okay, fine, for Morse the gift is a person, but why does that mean one has to return it? All I can do in such cases, is resort to Morse's own rather transparent attempt to dress up his analysis in causal language, invoking reasons that may at best be described as auxiliary to the main idea that I've just described. And I quote from him, "In this system of ideas," he writes, "one clearly and logically realizes that one must give back to another person what is really part and parcel of his nature and substance, because to accept something from somebody is to accept some part of his spiritual essence, of his soul." End of quote. Well, clearly and logically, this is just a tautology, and Morse himself must have known this, since he then immediately goes on to supplement his explanation by saying that for the Maori, the obligation to reciprocate is underwritten by the mortal threat of magical or divine retribution. The power of Morse's argument on the gift, then, is not so much explanatory as conceptual. Indeed, when I first decided to devote today's lecture to the role of conceptualization in anthropology, my plan was to provide more 101-style examples from across the different national and theoretical traditions of anthropology to show how, even as they are presented as attempts at explanation, interpretation, or whatever else, some of the most memorable and powerful ideas to have come out of anthropology have at their heart the intellectual operation I have just described. Particular ethnographic materials are transposed in terms of particular analytical problems and then work upon these problems by radically changing their conceptual shape. So, Lévi-Strauss transposing Amerindian myths in terms of the Kantian antinomies of the continuous nature and the discontinuous culture. Clifford Geertz using Balinese ritual calendars to conceptualize time as a static order of qualitatively differentiated days rather than a linear flow that is quantified sequentially. In Bali, as Geertz puts it so memorably, calendars don't tell you what day it is, but what kind of day it is. Or our own Mary Douglas, taking the concern with pollution in the kosher rules of the Leviticus and transposing it conceptually as a matter of anomalous classification operating at the interstices of established categories, pollution famously as matter out of place. What classic analyses such as these have in common, I suggest, is a concern with turning empirical materials into concepts, and the telltale sign is their morphological character. The continuous and the discontinuous, stasis and movement, qualitative difference and quantitative sequence, staying within categories or straying across them, all means of giving determinate shapes to the conceptual relations involved in articulating ethnographic particulars as objects of thought. Rather than just exemplifying this process, however, I'd like to explore its operation a little further by showing how conceptualizations travel across otherwise unrelated contexts of research, and in doing so mark trajectories of the development of anthropological thinking. Given the nature of the occasion, I shall do this with reference to the main line of thinking I've sought to develop in my own work, which I'll present as a trajectory of conceptual modulation consisting of 3 stages or conceptual moments. My PhD research on Afro-Cuban divination, which culminated in my monograph whose title Truth in Motion conveys part of the shape of its argument, my more recent attempt to change that shape a little, and then how that effort is modulated in my current research on revolutionary politics in Cuba. Now, I've spoken a lot of Morse, but in retrospect, my own PhD research, which focused on the Afro-Cuban divinatory tradition of Ifa, can be presented as an attempt to clarify a basic conceptual ambiguity involved in another argument that has achieved near sacred status in anthropology, namely the one advanced by Mary Douglas's teacher, Edward Evans Pritchard, who we tend to call in anthropology EP, so I'll use that to save time, regarding the difference between asking how misfortunes happen and asking why they happen. Famously based on his towering ethnography of the Azande people with whom he lived in South Sudan in the late 1920s, Evans Pritchard's brilliant insight has been conveyed to generations of students with reference to his arresting story of the burning Zande beer hut. A Zande man who accidentally sets fire to his beer hut, EP tells us, is well aware of how the fire was caused. He walked into the beer hut at night with his torch lit, the hut's roof is flammable, so it caught fire on contact with the flame. Yet at the same time, the man may be equally convinced that the incident was brought about by witchcraft, a suspicion that he can only verify by consulting a qualified diviner. His reasoning, according to Evans Pritchard, runs something like this, and I quote, "Every year, hundreds of Azande go and inspect their beer by night, and they always take with them a handful of straw to illuminate the hut." Yes. Why then should I, on this single occasion, have ignited the hatch of my hut? So what the oracle explains for the Azande are not the causal conditions that led to the fire, but rather, and I quote again, the particular conditions in a chain of causation which relate an individual to natural happenings in such a way that he sustained injury. End of quote. As an aside, it is worth noting here that EP's argument can be understood as a major precursor to the ontological approach I outlined in the beginning, if not in the history of the discipline, at least in the development of my own thinking about it. Certainly, EP makes it explicit that his distinction between how and why questions pertains to the limit of our capacity to understand analytically, from within the circle of our own assumptions about how explanations work, what's at stake for Zande oracles. To our minds, he writes, the only relationship between two independently caused facts is their coincidence in time and space. We have no explanation of why the two chains of causation intersected at a certain time and in a certain place, for there is no interdependence between them. Zande philosophy, and this is still EP speaking, can supply the missing link. Witchcraft explains the coincidence of these two happenings. End of quote. The Azande, in other words, have ways of thinking about things that we find altogether unintelligible. Where we can only shrug our shoulders and say, coincidence, they have a whole cosmology of witchcraft and divinatory procedures for detecting it. Still, as with Morse, EP's analysis is rather better at identifying the conceptual problem posed, in his case, by the Zande ethnography, than it is at providing its solution. After all, his brilliant idea that Zande oracles answer a different order of question from the causal ones that we are accustomed to asking as analysts, does not in itself help us much to make sense of why the Azande might take oracles to be the appropriate means for answering such questions. EP does, of course, provide a separate argument about why this may be so, the idea that Zande witchcraft, oracles, and magic form a kind of circle of mutually supporting beliefs which traps the Azande into their mystical ways of thinking. But this is problematic, I'd say unworkable, for reasons that I can't go into here. Instead, we may stick with his distinction between how and why questions to show that in its conceptual morphology, it is powerful enough to furnish a more complete analysis of divination, if not among the Azande, then certainly in Cuba, where I work. So, on the how side, we have causal explanations which account for a given event in terms of the sequence of causes that brought it about. This happened because that happened because of that, and so on. On the why side, by contrast, we have the collision between two otherwise independent causal trajectories at a certain time and place. From the point of view of causal thinking, this time and place is arbitrary, just a coincidence, and that's that. But EP's whole point is that the why questions of the Azande involve a kind of thinking that is altogether different. So calling them coincidences is just a category mistake. They just look like that when we try to understand them using causal concepts. What then if we try to understand them in their own terms? Here, EP's lucidly morphological conception of the distinction, which the slide behind me depicts, is illuminating. For while he may not have filled out its conceptual shape in this way himself, EP's characterization of why questions as intersections of mutually independent causal chains tells us two basic things about the way of thinking that they instantiate. First, that they deal in motions, and second, that these motions that when these motions intersect, they produce events. In fact, in this basic sense, why questions are like how questions back to front, a kind of conceptual figure ground reversal. The chains of causation that how questions rely on, these guys here, start with discrete events, this happened, that happened, and so on, and then set them into motion by connecting them sequentially, like a cascade of dominoes. Inversely, the non-causal intersections that why questions involve begin with vectors of motion from which a discrete event is derived by way of collision. In short, the how starts with discrete events and ends up with moving trajectories, while the why starts with vectors of motion and ends up with discrete events. Now, all this may sound like logical overdrive, the kind of thing I get accused of a lot. Taking EP's pithy distinction and turning it into some form of neo-scholastic conceptualism. Still, as I want to show, it is precisely by working at that deliberately abstract level that EP's ideas can be transposed half the way across the globe from Sudan to Cuba to furnish a conceptual framework that can make sense of the Afro-Cuban divinatory tradition of Ifa, which I've been studying ethnographically since the late 1990s. This guy should start moving. Yes, he did. Great. Brought to Cuba in the 19th century by slaves imported from West Africa, primarily to work at the island's booming sugar economy, Ifa today sits at the top of a vibrant constellation of Afro-Cuban ritual practices as the most prestigious form of divination. Initiates of Ifa are positioned as the ultimate arbiters of truth due to the supremacy of their oracle, through which the god of divination, Orunmila, or Orula for short, is able to speak. Orula's trademark, so to speak, is the truth. As initiates say themselves, his oracle never lies and never makes mistakes. This awesome power of veracity is owed to the fact that Orula was witness to the creation of the world, the birth of all things, as they put it, which is described in an inordinately complex corpus of myths that narrate the exploits of Orula and a host of other divinities in the primordial times of creation in Africa. These mythical narratives, to which initiates refer as the paths of Ifa, are classified into 256 divinatory configurations, or signs, as they're called, which operate a little like star signs do in Indo-European astrology. Each of them has its own name and is considered a divinity in its own right, or an avatar of Orula himself. So, in the ceremony of divination, the diviner casts 16 kola nuts, which is what you're watching behind me, or shells, to determine which of the 256 signs of Orula will be speaking, and he marks them in the tray there, and then proceeds to narrate some of the many mythical paths associated with a sign, which he then interprets so as to bring it to bear on the particular circumstances of the consultation. Diviners themselves sometimes speak of this process as one of metamorphosis, and they use the Greek word in Spanish and claim it as their own, metamorphosis. I come from Greece partly, so it's our word, actually. So they use this word metamorphosis. To reveal its message, the mythical narrative about Africa needs to be transformed. Its path, to use their metaphor, needs to be curved. Now, at the level of its content, EP's idea about why questions has only a limited purchase on Ifa divination. While clients do often bring these kinds of questions to the diviners, for example, why is my child sick, oracles in Ifa are used also in other ways, particularly when it comes to their role in regulating the ceremonial life of the initiates. In what sense, for example, is deciding on the date of an initiation ceremony a why question in Evans Pritchard's sense? As soon as one moves from content to conceptual form, however, the analytical purchase of EP's distinction proves quite stunning. Very much in line with the why logic of moving trajectories colliding to produce singular events, what we have in Ifa divination is a veritable choreography in which different kinds of moving trajectories are carefully modulated by the diviners who control their speed and direction, making them collide to produce particular kinds of events. Perhaps the most emblematic example is the act of casting on which the ceremony of divination is focused, and on which the clip you've been watching behind me has been looping. Coincidental in EP's sense, the success of the cast depends on the diviner's ability to ensure that the trajectories of each of the 16 kola nuts that he clasps in his hands remain above any suspicion of manipulation, so as to allow Orula, the divinity, to speak through them unimpeded in the form of the sign that is cast. The sign itself then emerges at the point of collision between 16 otherwise independent vectors of motion that are made to intersect and chaotically interfere with each other inside the diviner's hands, like this. The analytical power of this way of thinking, however, becomes most apparent when one runs it on the process of mythical interpretation that, as we saw, lies at the heart of Ifa diviner's claim to be delivering the truth. Indeed, not just any sort of truth, but a divine truth that is deemed to be immune to doubt. Remember, no lies, no mistakes. As we saw, Ifa diviners source the truths that they deliver to their clients in mythical narratives, which they conceive as paths that are first recounted and then interpreted, a process of metamorphosis, as I said. A mythical path recounting the incursion of one divinity into the kingdom of another is interpreted in the light of people's abiding concern with migration in Cuba today, and delivered to the consultant as a divine message about her prospects for traveling to the USA. A myth about a lion playing dead in order to find out what people will say about him at his funeral gets recast by the diviner as an admonition about a relative of his client who has gone into hiding in order to avoid paying his debts. Or even, as I describe in detail in my book on Ifa, a path that speaks of an island made of ice is metamorphosed interpretatively into an account of a client's broken refrigerator and its prospects for repair. Fridges, I should say, are a major headache for most people in Cuba due to the lack of spare parts as well as the heat. Talk about heat, my God, it's hot in here. The diviner's skill, then, lies in his capacity, and I keep saying his because these diviners can only be heterosexual men. It's a very macho environment. You're kind of barred from entering if you're a woman or if you're gay. So the diviner's skill, then, lies in his capacity to set in motion the meaning of the myths so as to bring them to bear on the circumstances of the consultant, whose own meaning is also shifted as a result. So Evans Pritchard's why logic is borne out point for point. Two mutually independent trajectories, that of the mythical path at the top and that of the consultant on whose life the myth is brought to bear, are made to collide with each other. Furthermore, a major analytical dividend of this way of conceptualizing the situation, which is perhaps the main point of my monograph, is that it allows us drastically to change the way we conceive of the truth the diviners deliver. Note how this image runs contrary to the standard assumption, made also by E.P. himself, that diviners are in the business of providing particular kinds of representations of their clients' circumstances, by which I mean discursive claims about the way things are in the world. For example, just like the truth of my claim, this room is full, depends on whether the room is actually full or not, the truth of the diviner's assertion that his client's fridge needs fixing would depend, according to this account, on whether the fridge is actually broken. By contrast, the analysis of divination I've offered yields a different conceptualization of truth. Diviner's claim to truth on this account consists not in representing the world, but rather in transforming its meaning. Truth is the event that corresponds to the moment at which the mythical path is made to collide with the life circumstances of the consultant, and thereby redefines them. The divinatory message, "You'll be traveling to the US," for example, changes the meaning of the client's circumstances. From being a person with no particular travel prospects, the client is rendered into a person who can expect an imminent journey. Understood as an event of redefinition, then, the diviner's truth claim is indeed special, beyond doubt, as I noted earlier, since it is true precisely by definition. Now, I have to admit that I was rather proud when my Microsoft Word-generated diagram of this idea made it onto the cover of my book, bearing out the points of its title, Truth in Motion, as I said. As I realized soon after it was published, however, the problem with it is that it's wrong. More precisely, while it does illustrate the concept of truth we need for Ifa, it gets wrong the cosmological coordinates within which these truth events take shape. So in a paper written initially for a workshop organized by Alice Elliott and others under the aegis of Kroc that Alan mentioned, a reading and research group Alan and I have been running together throughout my time at UCL, and which over the years has been a prime source of anthropological inspiration for me, as have Alice and Alan themselves. I sought in that paper to correct the mistake by articulating the basic asymmetry of the relationship between mythical parts on the one hand and the life trajectories that they transform on the other. The key problem is that contrary to the image behind me, the transformation only goes one way. The mythical parts of Ifa are so powerful because, deemed to contain within them the truth about everything, they can have a transformative effect on anything, i.e. any particular life circumstances that happen to occasion the consultation. To move in the opposite direction and try to alter the content of the mythical corpus of Ifa by bringing to bear on it the imponderabilia of everyday life, so to speak, would for the practitioners of Ifa be a cosmological non sequitur, something equivalent to a Catholic pilgrim saying that he goes, say, to Our Lady of Lourdes to cure the ailments of the Virgin Mary. It's kind of that kind of cosmological asymmetry. So perhaps a better image would look like this. A corpus of myths intensively containing everything within its 256 signs, which by that virtue is able to transform the meaning of any particular life circumstances on which it is ritually brought to bear, altering the course of their extensively unfolding trajectory in the process. I'd like to round off this tour of conceptual transformations by indicating briefly how some of their shapes can come to operate in a context that seems entirely unrelated, namely my current research on the experience of revolutionary politics in Cuba today. This is my portion of a larger project charting comparatively the anthropologies of revolutionary societies, as we call them on the project, by which we mean simply the way in which people are formed in acts of revolution and the social transformations these acts precipitate. And I've put up the slide of the project structure and what each of the core research team does on it, not to illustrate my arguments about morphology, but just because I'm so proud of how it looks. We call it the project flower, and when we did it, I was like so happy with it. Until someone in Helsinki told me that this new neoliberal government talks of everything in terms of flowers, so I was like really unhappy about that. Anyway, now, about 1 year into the project, I had something of a personal epiphany when I realized that its core concern with the formation of revolutionary personhood could be understood as a version of the kinds of problems I have just outlined in relation to Ifa divination. One could say, for example, that the transformation of consciousness that often lies at the heart of revolutionary attempts to mold a so-called new man is somehow analogous to the kind of transformations that Ifa divination produces. That was supposed to be a question. Could one say that? Indeed, might one not simply graft onto my original diagram of Ifa truth events the orchestrated ways in which state revolutionary societies try to inculcate revolutionary ideology in their citizens? Now we're back on the trajectory. In such a case, revolutionary ideology would be the structural equivalent of Ifa myth. Think of Mao's Little Red Book or Fidel Castro's interminable speeches. And the diagram would essentially depict how this ideology operates on people, co-opting them into the project of revolution by way of ideological conversion. Still, while such a way of thinking may capture some of the psychology of ideological conversion, again, I think it gets the cosmology wrong. Of course, in this case, the cosmological problem is somewhat different from the one we encountered in Ifa, although not altogether unrelated. In particular, any attempt to understand the constitution of personhood in revolutionary situations must take into account the peculiarly totalizing character of revolutions, as at all-embracing political ruptures aimed at a wholesale transformation of society. Indeed, the very idea of a politics that sets out deliberately to create a new kind of person is itself an expression of this totalizing impulse. Seen anthropologically, one might say that a distinguishing feature of revolutions is that they posit themselves as cosmogonic acts above all. Not a matter of just changing or improving the social order, but rather of replacing it with a new one, creating a new political universe. Indeed, my research on the experience of revolution in Cuba explores how this project of political totalization is instituted in Cuban society, for example, through the socially transcendental role of the state, and how, in its increasingly ailing form today, it articulates with social structures and practices that make alternative claims on people's formation and comportment, such as kinship and gender, neighborhood, and indeed religion. Note, however, that as soon as the problem is put in these terms, our earlier cosmological correction of the morphology of Ifa truth gains an immediate purchase. Once again, in attempting to conceptualize the relationship between the state revolutionary process and the people on whom it operates, we have to reckon with a cosmological asymmetry. An all-embracing everything, on the one hand, indeed this is the word Fidel Castro himself used in one of his most famous speeches already in 1960, inside the revolution everything, he said, against it nothing. So on the one hand we have this revolutionary everything, and on the other hand, again, we have the imponderabilia of everyday life that this revolutionary everything has set out radically to transform. So might we use the conceptual shape of Ifa divination to gain an analytical handle on the Cuban Revolution as well? Well, while this may come a little closer, the problem is that it elides a crucial distinction between what everything means in the context of the revolution and what it means in the cosmology of Ifa divination. Even today, Cubans have a sense of the revolutionary process as a condition that is totalizing because it surrounds them, insinuating itself in everything that they do, and in that very visceral sense contains them, very much in line with Fidel's original dictum, everything within the revolution. Thus, Cuban people's lives do not get transformed by colliding into the revolutionary process, as in Ifa, but rather by the manner and the degree to which the revolution is able to encompass them within its historically unfolding attempts at self-totalization. Something like an ongoing, though in Cuba by now visibly decrepit, project of cosmological infrastructure, as Caroline Humphrey, my PhD supervisor, might have put it. As you can see from the messy slide, I've yet to work this out. But at present, it seems to me that the distinction between figure and ground, what I'm trying to play with here, might be one way to articulate morphologically the transcendental character that revolution comes to acquire on this analysis, as something of a hidden premise for the unfolding of people's lives in Cuba today. To close then, I suspect that at this point, some of you may be wondering what all the fuss is about. Sure, you may be thinking, my argument about conceptualization may serve as a neat device for a potted story of my own anthropological development, diagrams and all. But if even I am openly admitting that my point is exemplified by such a bread and butter instances of anthropological thinking as Morse on the Gift and EP on the Azande, then surely there's not much new here. Still, on this I'm happy to bite the bullet. Perhaps finding value in some of the best our discipline has offered is itself worth something. Just to make sure, however, let me draw out 3 consequences of what I've argued and see if you'd follow me there too. The first I have stated already, which is that conceptualization on this account emerges not merely as a step towards some other, weightier anthropological goal, such as social explanation or cross-cultural translation, but as a sui generis end in itself. This is why in my subtitle I've sought to dignify this as an intellectual project in its own right, a new social morphology no less. Indeed, the contrast with a classical project of social morphology, as conceived by Durkheim and his circle a century ago, makes my point. For Durkheim, the study of social morphology involved charting the demographic and geographic configurations of social relationships, the density of social groups, their distribution and seasonal movements, and so on, in order to work out their effects on social institutions and the collective representations they generate. By contrast, the social morphology I have in mind charts out the conceptual relationships that the analyst has to imagine in order to describe such phenomena. This is a morphology not of the social world, but of the analytical operations required to describe it. The second point has to do with the deliberate contingency of these operations. And here the contrast with another famous proposal about the role of concepts in anthropology is useful, namely Edmund Leach's suggestion in Rethinking Anthropology that in order rigorously to generalize about social phenomena, one should conceive of them, in order rigorously to generalize about social phenomena, one should conceive of them in terms of the mathematical patterns they form. For Leach, the abstraction of algebra is necessary if anthropology is to avoid merely describing one contingent case of social organization after another, an activity he famously disparaged as a kind of butterfly collecting, in order to focus instead on the general laws that may underlie them. By contrast, my suggestion here is that the abstraction of concepts furnishes the language in which anthropologists can embrace the very contingency Leach found so irritating. In other words, the forms of conceptualization I've sought to illustrate tonight are not acts of generalization, but of expression. A matter not of abstracting away from life, if you like, but of moving towards it. In fact, I think Leach's image of butterfly collecting is entirely opposite to the activity. Imagine anthropology as an act of conceptual butterfly collecting, in which the varieties of social experience the world over are transfigured as live possibilities for our conceptual imagination, expressed in the language of morphology. A low-use, high-value activity, shall we say. Which brings me to my final point, which is that the essentially expressive character of anthropological inquiry, as I understand it, puts our discipline more in the vicinity of the practice of art than we are perhaps accustomed to imagine. And I'm not talking about creative writing as in Clifford Geertz here, which is fine, by the way. I'm just not talking about that. Now, I could hardly presume to try to define art, and certainly not in the presence of David Burrows, who is about to comment on this lecture from an artist's point of view. Might we nevertheless say that whatever it might be, art is in some sense an act of expression, in which something, some part of life, an image, an activity, a thought, a deed, indeed a relationship, is transfigured and conveyed in another medium. Well, that's what I think anthropology is, the attempt to take anything, any part of life, and transfigure it in the morphological language of concepts, the shapes of their relations.
Done it. I'm a Mac user, so it's hard. Hi. So when Martin asked me to respond to a lecture, I was very honoured. It was only about 40 minutes ago that I realised I was meant to give a vote of thanks. I have no idea what that is. Thanks, Martin. I think it's a fantastic lecture. And now I'm going to give my response. But so, I'll find page 1. So, congratulations on becoming a professor. I think it's well deserved. But also, congratulations on your diagrams. They are fantastic. You are now a king of diagrams. And I think I'm beginning to grasp what you mean by the morphology I'll quote you, morphology of reshaping concepts through them. And I don't think there's much that I can add to this. So I thought in the little time that I had, I thought I could comment on figure-ground relationships, which, as you alluded to, artists should know something about. And I thought I could say something about concepts, social life, and anthropology as art in the process. So, to be clear about what I understand, perhaps for ethnographic reasons, by figure-ground relationships. I have an image here, a painting by Louis Boff-Popova. It's a work in which, and I think if you concentrate on this black triangle, whether it's a solid or a form, and you would probably all know this, you can in your mind make it a solid or a void, depending on how you see it. A solid or a void appears before you in relation to how you think it. And I think this idea that figure and ground relations are produced not just through perception, but in thought, and through, I would say, an imaginary, is supported by anthropologist Roy Wagner, who I've learnt about through meeting Martin. So in the conversation with the coyote, which I'm sure many of you have read, Roy Wagner says, he proposes that much of what you anthropologists write, much of what you say or you attribute meaning to in various situations of social life, it relates to actually what is absent and what is not present. And I think there's something here very similar to how C.S. Peirce, famous diagrammer, perhaps thought of things. Because Wagner goes on to suggest that when we first become conscious of something, which he calls first attention, which is the link to Peirce, we also see a second thing that we are not conscious of, that we pass over as unimportant or as background. And Wagner then suggests that experiencing foreground and background at the same time, which he calls third attention, requires one to die in the process. For developing the third kind of attention requires not doing, he says, which he does admit is a kind of doing, but it's one in which perception involves stopping the world. But it's hard to die, it's hard to stop the world, it takes practice, and it's hard to detach yourself from a familiar world. And as Margaret Strathern suggests or states, it's hard to stop making comparisons all the time. So one thing that I've continued to wonder, probably badger Martin a bit, about, if empirical materials are turned into concepts by anthropologists and inverted and reversed, I just keep wondering about what the role is of the imaginary, both the specular imaginary and what we might call the social imaginary, and perhaps fiction too. And this might be where we get on to art. And particularly, I've been thinking about this in relation to social morphology 2.0. I think I'm beginning to understand it. So this interests me a lot. It's probably a naive question, but that's one of the things that I'm going to try and talk a bit about. So Martin obviously alludes to this in his lecture, not least when he says, the social morphology I have in mind charts out the conceptual relationships that the analyst has to imagine in order to describe such phenomena. So, yeah, that's the question I have, like, what is the role of the imaginary in this? And does the imaginary just make the space for the play of concepts, or are the concepts supported by imaginary registers of all kinds? I think that's a kind of obvious question, but that's what interests me. Because for me, the imaginary, and this is probably a familiar reading, but the imaginary is what ties together the real and or what might be abstract to the abstractions of the symbolic and language. So I have an example, which I probably don't need to give you to explain it, but it's an artwork by my colleague. It's by Kerry Young, and it's a work that's exhibited in America. So if you step into this, what I'm calling a cube, which is perhaps the figure, perhaps we can think of it as the figure, you're no longer bound by the Constitution. In a way, you're free of the land of the free, which probably is an attractive idea at the moment. Everything else falls away. So my obvious point here is that this only works if there's a ground of America produced in an imaginary register, which is not to say America is not real, or that it's just a kind of written fiction, but it's not exactly present either. So, but I think to suggest, and as Martin would probably agree, that anthropologists do something similar is probably not a controversial thing. And I know that from reading anthropology, I was really struck by Strathern in her introduction of Gender of the Gift, who said She was talking about Darwin and how complex the world is and how difficult it is to capture that. And she was saying that what she wants is modes of research that acknowledge the complexities of social life, because they're never fully captured by analytical forms. So only thing you can do is produce analytical forms that somehow are equivalent to the complexity of what you're studying. And to quote her, she says, "It is to the fictional end that I contrive to give the language of analysis an internal dialogue. And it's not history that I myself look to then, but the way that one might hold analysis as a kind of convenient or controlled fiction." I'm not sure this is quite what Martin is looking for in anthropology as generative, expressive art. I'm not a great believer in expression, but but I understand where you're going. But I think in creating a feedback loop between fiction and analysis and the real, through the operations of the imaginary, something like art is produced. And I think that's what I'm learning from you. So just to finish, because I know we're all melting, I want to put forward a candidate for the best artist anthropologist that's ever existed, which won't be any surprise, is Alfred Gell, who said, and I was delighted to learn this, he was less concerned with contributing to his field than with presenting counterintuitive narrative ideas. So he said about what he wanted to do that it was his idea to create a certain frisson. It's all gone quiet now, Menton Gell. Maybe he's gone out of fashion. A certain frisson, this is what he said, a certain artistic effect which could be achieved by taking a random collection of objects which could be made to fit together in an interesting way. And this is the bit I really like. You know, like a bird decorating its nest with an arrangement of little pieces of tissue paper, a leaf and a flower, which I think is great, and I hope the ref panel for art design are reading Gell. And so I think what really delights me about this is it eschews doctrine. And so just to finish with one more quote from Gell, the artist. He says that he teaches through a series of experiments for their own sake, providing examples of a particular performance, this is Gell now, and getting others to do likewise. And he says, but it is as an exemplary stylist that I want to make my mark on the world. I was trying to do a series of tricks to get the machine to work. So I would take Gell at his word here. He's a trickster, producing machines and matrices as technologies of enchantment to beguile and challenge existing wisdoms and to move beyond imaginary figures and grounds. And I think to scramble our imaginaries, both specular and social. And so perhaps all anthropologists who are artists, you're all tricksters. I don't mean a slight by this. I'm recognising you as a fellow artist. But I'd also like to say thanks, personally. Thank you for taking me on the adventure of anthropology. I can see, by the way, that you work with the people in CARP. They clearly love you. You're clearly a very generous leader and teacher. And I'm sure if there was a vote of thanks, we'd all give it to you. So thank you, Martin. And congratulations.
So let me just finally second that vote of thanks for a fantastic lecture, demonstrating the clarity of thought, the logic chopping. You were saved from philosophy going on with logic chopping, went into the much richer field of looking at humanity. And sorry, I don't want to offend any philosophers who may find themselves here, but I think the combination of the philosophical, conceptual capacity for logical thinking, the clarity of thinking, and the looking at the real world and trying to understand what links witchcraft in Africa with Cuban revolutionaries. I'm sorry you didn't take Brexit any further after the initial tantalising mention, nor did you quite get into Trump, but left it a little bit south of him. But wonderful tour de force showing us the ways in which clear thinking, reconceptualisation, theoretical analysis can actually show how intellectual life is a truly creative endeavour and a wonderful one. It's not just butterfly collections, even though that was a nice slide too. So thank you again, Martin. And just to remind everyone that we go on now to celebrate Martin's promotion with a reception in the Anthropology Department in Taverton Street. So I hope to see as many of you as would like to come to that there. Thank you.